Britain's parks look peaceful, green lawns, quiet lakes, families enjoying the afternoon. But some hide darker stories, disasters, forgotten graves, and moments when something went terribly wrong. Regent's Park, London. Regent's Park is one of the most elegant parks in London. Wide lawns stretch between quiet lakes and carefully planted gardens. On warm afternoons, families sit beside the water, while joggers follow long tree-lined paths through the park. It is the kind of place designed to feel calm. But during the winter of 1867, Regent's Park became the site of one of the most disturbing accidents in Victorian London. That winter had been unusually cold. For weeks, the temperature remained below freezing, and the ornamental lake inside the park froze solid. Ice skating quickly became a popular attraction. By the afternoon of the 15th of January, hundreds of people had gathered on the lake. Some estimates suggested more than 500 skaters were scattered across the frozen surface, while large crowds watched from the banks. At first, the scene looked almost festive. Children glided across the ice. Young couples attempted careful turns, while spectators applauded from the shore. Then, without warning, the ice began to crack. Witnesses later described hearing a deep splitting sound spreading across the lake. Within seconds, large sections of the ice collapsed. Dozens of skaters fell directly into the freezing water below. Many could not swim. Even those who could quickly found themselves trapped by heavy Victorian clothing that soaked up water and dragged them under the surface. People on the banks rushed forward to help. Branches were lowered toward the water, while others lay flat on the remaining ice, trying to pull victims out before they disappeared beneath the broken slabs. But the collapse had happened too suddenly. By the time the water settled again, the scale of the disaster had become clear. Around 40 people had died. For days afterwards, divers searched the lake, while crowds gathered silently along the edge of the park. The tragedy shocked London. Authorities eventually reduced the depth of the lake so that such an accident could never happen again. Today, the water looks shallow and peaceful. Visitors walk past it without noticing anything unusual. But on very cold evenings, when the wind moves quietly across the lake, it is difficult not to imagine the moment when laughter on the ice suddenly turned into silence. Postman's Park, London. Hidden among the narrow streets near St. Paul's Cathedral lies one of the smallest parks in London. Postman's Park is easy to miss. A few trees, quiet benches, and a small garden tucked between old buildings in the historic center of the city. At lunchtime, office workers sit here to escape the noise of traffic only a few streets away. Nothing about the place feels unusual at first, but along one wall of the park stands a memorial unlike any other in Britain. Under a wooden shelter, a rows of ceramic tiles known as the Memorial to Heroic Self-Sacrifice. Each tile records the story of a person who died while attempting to save someone else. The memorial was created at the beginning of the 20th century by the artist George Frederick Watts. His idea was simple. Acts of courage performed by ordinary people should not be forgotten simply because the heroes were not famous. The plaques tell their stories in only a few lines. One remembers Alice Ayres, a young nursemaid who rescued 3 children from a burning house before falling from an upper window. Another records Henry Tagg, who drowned in the River Thames while trying to pull a friend from the water. There are many others. A laborer who died saving a colleague during an accident. A boy who attempted to rescue another child from a canal. A woman who entered a burning building to help strangers trapped inside. Most of the people remembered here were completely ordinary Londoners. Clerks, servants, workers, children. They did not expect to be remembered in history. Yet each tile marks the moment when someone made a decision that cost them their life. Visitors often notice that reading the plaques slowly changes the atmosphere of the park. What begins as a quiet garden gradually becomes something else. a place where dozens of final moments are recorded in small lines of glazed ceramic. There is another detail that adds to the strange feeling of the place. Before it became a public park in the 19th century, this land was used as burial ground for nearby churches. Over centuries, the soil slowly rose as graves accumulated beneath it. Today, the grass and trees hide that earlier history completely. People eat their lunch on the benches. Tourists pass through on their way to St. Paul's. Yet along the memorial wall, the stories remain. Small, quiet reminders that some of the most extraordinary moments in history were performed by people whose names almost disappeared. And in the silence of this small London park, those names continue to be read. Burgess Park, South London. Burgess Park is one of the largest green spaces in South London. Cyclists move along wide paths. Children play football across open fields, while dog walkers follow quiet routes through young trees planted across the park. At first glance, it feels like a modern landscape, carefully designed during the late 20th century as part of a large urban redevelopment project. But before the park existed, this land looked very different. For generations, the area was packed with narrow streets and rows of Victorian houses belonging to the working communities of Camberwell. Today, almost none of those streets remain. They disappeared during redevelopment in the 1970s, replaced by the open space visitors see now. Yet decades before the park was created, something happened here that residents would remember for years. During the First World War, London experienced a new and frightening kind of attack. German airships known as Zeppelins crossed the North Sea under cover of darkness, flying high above British cities before releasing bombs onto the streets below. Late on the night of the 19th of October, 1917, one of those airships appeared over South London. Most people were asleep. Witnesses later described hearing a distant engine somewhere above the clouds, followed by a sudden explosion that shook nearby houses. Bombs began falling across the Camberwell district. One struck a row of houses directly tearing through buildings where families had been sleeping only moments before. Windows shattered across neighboring streets. Debris filled the air while people rushed outside in confusion, trying to understand what had happened. By morning, the damage was clear. 10 civilians had been killed. More than 20 others were injured by collapsing buildings and flying fragments of brick and glass. For many residents, it was the first time war had reached their own neighborhood. The attack left craters where homes once stood, and deep scars in a community already living under the pressure of wartime shortages and uncertainty. In the decades that followed, the houses were rebuilt, and life slowly returned to normal. Eventually, the neighborhood itself disappeared as redevelopment reshaped the area into Burgess Park. Today, the lawns look calm. Children run across the same ground where streets once stood. Visitors rarely realize that beneath the open grass once lay the remains of houses destroyed in a single night of war. Yet standing in the park on a quiet evening when the wind moves through the trees and the sky above South London grows dark, it is easy to imagine how suddenly that quiet was once broken. Victoria Park, East London. Victoria Park has long been known as the Green Heart of East London. Opened in the middle of the 19th century, it quickly became a refuge for the crowded neighborhoods surrounding it. On summer weekends, the lawns fill with families, musicians, and cyclists moving slowly along the wide paths. The park was designed to give the growing population of the East End a place to breathe. But not every gathering here has ended peacefully. In the year 1858, a strange rumor began circulating through London newspapers and public conversation. It concerned a mysterious plant known as the upas tree, said to release poisonous vapors capable of killing anyone who stood nearby. The story had appeared in travel accounts for years, usually describing distant jungles somewhere in Southeast Asia. Yet somehow, the rumor found its way into the streets of London. One Sunday afternoon, crowds had gathered in Victoria Park as they often did during warm weather. Families walked the paths while children played near the lakes. Then someone shouted that a deadly tree had been discovered nearby. The reaction was immediate. People began pushing toward the exits, convinced that a poisonous gas might spread through the park at any moment. Within seconds, panic moved through the crowd. Men and women rushed toward the gates, while others were knocked to the ground in the confusion. The movement of hundreds of frightened people quickly became impossible to control. By the time order was restored, 7 people had died in the crush. Investigations later confirmed that there had never been any poisonous tree in the park at all. The disaster had been caused entirely by a rumor. But Victoria Park carries an even older layer of history beneath its lawns. Long before the park was created, parts of this land were used as burial grounds during outbreaks of disease that overwhelmed the city. The most devastating of these was the Great Plague of 1665, when thousands of victims were buried quickly in large pits outside London's crowded streets. Over the centuries, the city expanded across those burial sites. Roads, houses, and eventually public parks appeared above ground that once held the victims of epidemics. Today, Victoria Park feels lively and open. Rowboats drift slowly across the lakes. Joggers circle the paths at sunrise, while music drifts through the air during festivals. Yet early in the morning before the crowds arrive, the park can feel unusually still, a wide landscape in the middle of a restless city, and beneath the grass, the quiet memory of events that once turned this peaceful space into a place of sudden panic. Beauty Park, Cardiff. Bute Park stretches along the River Taff in the centre of Cardiff. It is one of the largest urban parks in Britain. Wide lawns run beneath tall trees, while quiet paths follow the slow curve of the river. Students from the nearby university cross the park each day, and families gather here on warm afternoons when the city feels busy. At first glance, the landscape appears calm and carefully preserved. But the river running through the park has a long and uneasy history. Before modern flood defences were built, the River Taff was unpredictable. During the 18th and early 19th centuries, sudden floods regularly struck the lower parts of Cardiff, especially after long periods of rain in the surrounding valleys. One of the most destructive floods occurred late in the 1800s, when heavy storms sent enormous volumes of water down from the Welsh hills. The river rose quickly during the night. By morning, large parts of the town near the riverbanks were underwater. Streets turned into channels of fast-moving current, while wooden carts, livestock, and pieces of damaged buildings drifted through the flood. Several homes collapsed under the pressure of the water. Witnesses later described seeing furniture and personal belongings floating past, while residents attempted to escape through upper windows or onto nearby rooftops. When the flood finally receded, bodies were discovered along the riverbanks and in the muddy fields that once surrounded the city. The River Taff had always been both a resource and a danger for the communities living beside it. Long before the park existed, the same riverbanks were also used for public punishments. In earlier centuries, criminals were sometimes executed near the edge of the town, their deaths serving as warnings to others who passed along the road. Records from the 18th century describe crowds gathering near the river to witness these events. Over time, Cardiff expanded. The industrial city grew, the flood defences improved, and the land beside the river slowly transformed into the park visitors see today. Now the paths follow the water peacefully. Cyclists move between the trees, while rowers travel quietly along the river during the evening. Yet the River Taff continues to carry the long memory of the city, and when the wind moves across the surface of the water at dusk, it becomes easier to imagine the earlier moments when this calm landscape was far less forgiving. Holyrood Park, Edinburgh. Holyrood Park rises dramatically at the edge of Edinburgh's old city. Dominated by the rocky hill known as Arthur's Seat, the landscape feels ancient compared with the streets surrounding it. Paths wind through rough grassland and volcanic rock, while the skyline of Edinburgh spreads out below. Climbing the hill today is one of the most popular walks in Scotland. But in the 19th century, the park became the centre of one of the strangest discoveries in British history. In the year 1836, several boys were exploring the slopes of Arthur's Seat, searching for rabbits among the rocks. While climbing along a small cliff face, they noticed something hidden inside a narrow crevice. At first, it looked like a collection of small wooden boxes. Curious, the boys pulled one free. Inside was a tiny coffin. When they opened it, they discovered a carefully carved wooden figure dressed in miniature clothing. Soon, more coffins were found. One after another, they were removed from the rock, each containing a small wooden figure lying inside as if prepared for burial. By the end of the search, 17 miniature coffins had been recovered. Each figure had been dressed individually, some with painted faces and tiny boots. No one knew who had placed them there or why. The discovery quickly attracted attention across Edinburgh. Newspapers reported the strange find, while scholars and curious residents tried to explain the meaning of the coffins. Some believed they were connected to old folk rituals or symbolic burials. Others suggested a darker theory. Only a few years earlier, the city had been shocked by the crimes of Burke and Hare, two men who murdered victims in order to sell their bodies for medical dissection. Some historians later wondered if the coffins might represent symbolic burials for victims who had never received proper graves. But no explanation has ever been proven. The remaining coffins are now preserved in the National Museum of Scotland. Yet the place where they were discovered still exists, high on the slope of Arthur's Seat. Visitors climb past it every day without noticing the narrow crevice in the rock. From the summit, the view across Edinburgh is spectacular. Wind moves across the hills, while the city spreads quietly below. But somewhere along that rocky hillside, hidden among the stone and grass, lies the place where 17 tiny coffins once waited in silence for someone to find them. Pollok Park, Glasgow. Pollok Park is the largest park in Glasgow. Woodland paths stretch for miles through quiet forest, while open fields surround the historic Pollok House. On weekends, families picnic beside the river, and children explore the wide lawns that seem far removed from the busy streets of the city. The park feels spacious and calm, but like many places in Glasgow, the land carries traces of a more difficult past. During the 19th century, the city expanded rapidly as industry and shipbuilding transformed the River Clyde into one of the busiest industrial regions in the world. Thousands of workers arrived from across Britain and Ireland looking for employment. The sudden growth created crowded neighborhoods where living conditions were often poor. Disease spread quickly through these districts, especially during outbreaks of cholera that struck several British cities during the 1800s. In some cases, the number of deaths overwhelmed local burial grounds. Temporary burial areas were sometimes established on land outside the densest parts of the city, including fields that would eventually become public parks. While the exact locations of these early graves are not always precisely recorded, historians believe that parts of the land around modern Pollok Park were used in this way during periods of crisis. The park's history also intersects with the turbulent years of the 20th century. During the Second World War, Glasgow became an important industrial target. German bombers attacked the city repeatedly during the period known as the Clydebank Blitz, damaging homes, factories, and surrounding neighborhoods. Air raid sirens once echoed across the same districts that now border the park. Today, Pollok Park presents a very different scene. Ancient oak trees shade quiet walking trails. Highland cattle graze in open fields while visitors explore the long avenues leading toward Pollok House. Most people come here simply to enjoy the landscape. Yet early in the morning before the crowds arrive, The park can feel unexpectedly still. Mist sometimes settles between the trees, while the river moves slowly through the woods. It is in moments like these that the park feels less like a modern city landscape and more like a place layered with different chapters of Glasgow's past. A peaceful park on the surface, but one shaped quietly by the history that came before it. Britain's parks may appear peaceful, yet many hold stories that shaped the communities around them. Understanding those histories helps us see familiar places a little differently. If you enjoy uncovering hidden history, consider subscribing to Lines Unveiled and share any places whose past still lingers.